the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today we are flying over the North Pole to Sweden to speak with Frida Rydqvist Ilahi. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Jen. So nice to meet you.
So nice to meet you. Yeah, it's wonderful. This is our first meeting, and you are representing astrology in Sweden. I know you've done some work with Kepler before, and you're currently practicing. So let's just get down into it. What was your first astrology book?
My first astrology book was probably The Inner Sky by Steven Forrest. And, to make a long story short, I was together with a guy, and he came from a family of astrologers. And they had been practicing astrology for, years and years and years. And they were very, very, I would say, caught up in astrology, or they were really like living based off astrology. And he had so many books. Whatever he did, he basically connected it to astrology. And me, meeting this person and going into a relationship with him, it really influenced me because prior to that, I had never really heard of or practiced real, astrology. I had heard about sun sign astrology and horoscopes in magazines, but I had never really gotten in contact with the real kind of astrology, more in-depth kind of astrology. So, to make a long story short, we were together. I went to different countries with him. He had Serbian roots. So I went to Serbia and I went to different kinds of astrologers in Serbia, also in Sweden. And a few years later, we decided to split up. And he had some sort of life crisis, I would say. I don't know really how to explain it, but there was something, he was questioning a lot of things in his life. He was also questioning astrology. And he had also been practicing numerology. So he was like in this life crisis moment, and he decided, no, I'm going to quit astrology. I'm going to go all for numerology. And that's why when we split up, he had like these boxes full of books with astrology books.
You got astrology in the breakup?
Yes, that's how I got astrology. And that's so interesting, because most people, they perhaps come in contact with astrology through, I don't know, other women maybe, or I would say today is maybe TikTok,
Yeah.
But for me, the guy and his father, who was an astrologer, and, he was just like, let me just throw out these books. I want to get rid of them as soon as possible. And I was there and I told him, listen, you cannot throw away books. You cannot do that. I have to take care of these books, So in our split, I just ended up taking all these books. And I remember one of the first books I picked up was The Inner Sky by Steven Forrest. And that was also one of his, I would say, Bibles. So that's how I got introduced to astrology. And I can say, based on the fact that he had been so into it, and so I would say a little bit dogmatic even in his practice, I didn't want to practice the same way, if you know what I mean. I still wanted to keep one foot on the ground or one foot in the, in the other world.
Yeah.
So I read these books, and it was probably when I had Uranus transiting my sun. I'm at early Taurus.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually when I, for real, said to myself, you know what? I've had these books for so many years. I've studied since 2011, roughly. Now it's time for me to come out as an astrologer. When you're, causing this kind of disruption and turning myself upside down, inside out, astrology was such a great practice because I was battling a lot of anxiety, a lot of questions within myself. And the only time that I could basically rest from anxiety was when I picked up one of these astrology books, because that required so much attention from me. And astrology is quite complex, right?
Yeah.
So it took so much attention from me that I sort of, found myself more connected to the now, which eased my anxiety, or the fact that, Uranus was right on my sun,
Oh, wow. I love that. Yeah. It's amazing how they say sometimes astrology is ruled by Saturn. It's like if you're having anxiety, which I do think, Uranus is partly that, but also Saturn, it's like astrology's like, no, just study me and you'll be fine.
Exactly.
Like, it gets you oriented in your timeline. It gets you a sense of like when it's going to end.
Yeah, and connect to something tangible, something, structural, or what you say. And to go a little bit into that, you talk about Saturn, and I just want to say that I am a modern astrologer.
Yeah.
I think you have had some traditional astrologers on the show as well, and I'm not sure how you practice, but I'm a modern astrologer, and maybe also that's why one of my first books was The Inner Sky, which is from a more modern perspective, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. So here comes the big question. If you were going to go to a deserted island and you could only take 3 astrology books with you out of your stash, what would they be?
This question becomes very philosophical for me to begin with, because first of all, I just want to say that I understand the question and I agree with the question, but how can I say this? If I would go to a deserted island, I would probably just bring food, because I'm a Taurus. And also relates to how I practice astrology, because I see astrology as something that really enriches my life. It's to enrich my life. It's very much like a cultural practice or something almost like art. That's how I see astrology. But if I would bring 3 books, I would probably bring, first of all, a book about Pluto, because I love Pluto, and I also have a Scorpio moon, and I have Pluto very close to my moon in Scorpio. Which according to modern astrology rules Scorpio, right? So I'm very much into this, the Plutonian experience and reading about this. So I have The Power of Pluto is the book called. And this is a little bit of an older book. I think it's from 1979. It's by Arlene Robertson and Margaret Wilson. How I got this book is also an interesting story, because I work as a PhD student. I'm a psychologist, and I'm a 4th-year PhD student right now, about to graduate.
Congrats.
Yeah, thank you. So I work at the university, and in the city where my university is located, we also have a very, very tiny, you call it antique, maybe bookstore, or like an old bookstore.
Yeah.
Where they have a section of astrology books. And sometimes I go in there after office hours, after I've been at university. And one day I found that he had gotten a lot of new books that came in. So I found this book, The Power of Pluto, there. And as I opened the book, I saw that, oh, wow, there's a name in this book, a name of a woman. So I was like, okay, interesting. Because, Sweden, I'm in Sweden. Astrology is not so big here, and especially not in the city of Lund, where my university is located, because we have a lot of scientism, and a lot of people are extremely skeptical against astrology, and our whole society here in Sweden is extremely science ruled, I would say. So anyway, I saw this name in the book, and I was just like, oh, interesting. And I saw somebody had, marked a lot of paragraphs and phrases in the book. So I decided to look this person up, and sounds a bit like a creep, but I'm a Scorpio moon. I need to know things.
I love it.
I looked her up, and it turned out that she was actually a retired astrologer.
Oh, wow.
Super interesting, because the books I bought like a bunch of books, and all of them had belonged to her.
Oh, wow.
And after some thought, I called her up. I called her, and was a lovely woman, and she told me so many stories about how she used to practice astrology, and she even had like her own TV show here in Sweden.
Wow.
Yeah, she would meet like celebrities, and she would have like mystery charts, or what do you say, and try to guess the right or pair the right chart with the person. So she told me so many stories, and she told me so many stories about, her Saturn returns. And I figured that the moment when I reached out to her was the time around her 3rd Saturn return. That was very interesting for me to understand. So anyway, to go into the book briefly, I love the book because it's older, because it's from the 70s. And I also love it because on the first pages in this book, there's a very, very profound description of the Plutonian experience, of what it means to sort of go through this, you can call it, symbolical death rebirth process, and how all of us somehow face this cycle sometime in our lives, regardless of how Pluto impacts our chart or what we're born with. They describe this process in such a profound way that I think it's just beautiful. I love the depth of it, and I love the fact that we can also carry the legacy from astrologer to astrology through the books. And just like my ex-partner how to say, passed on the astrologer craft to me by giving me the books. I found this book in a bookstore, and it's related to an older lady who used to be a very successful astrologer in Sweden. I think it's just beautiful.
That is amazing. I love that.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you think that being so close to the Arctic Circle puts you in touch with a kind of Plutonian experience that people who don't live that far north have?
I'm not sure really about that. Sometimes I do think that. Let me say it like this. If we think about the Plutonian experience just in terms of, let's say that we have generations born with the same Pluto sign, right? And we tend to perhaps transform something more from a mass perspective. Then I could say that, yes, I do believe that people who live, for example, in Sweden, we are at the forefront of this kind of transformation because, as I said, our society is very, how do you say, it's like black and white in terms of these practices. Either you practice something scientific or you practice something, I don't know, occult or woohoo somehow,
Yeah.
And I can say from my experience, I've faced a lot of difficulty in terms of this theme because I am a psychologist, I am an academic. I've had a lot of people against me when it comes to me being open about my astrological practice. So many people have questioned it, and it's not so easy also because it's not even allowed in my country to practice astrology if you are, for example, licensed psychologist.
Wow.
Like I used to work in the clinical psychiatry. So to that point, speaking about, giving up or letting go or transforming or taking, another look at power, I have chosen to give up my psychological license, my therapeutic license, just so I can be more free and own more of my own power in terms of being able to practice astrology on the side.
Wow.
Because it's okay for me as a PhD student, I'm doing research, I'm doing my things there, but it's very difficult if I would have like a therapeutic license and practice clinical psychology and also do astrology on the side.
Wow.
That's difficult in my country. So in that sense, I relate to that. Not based on the fact that we're close to the pole, but more based on the fact of how our cultural climate is here, I would say.
Yeah. Do you know of any movements to change that law?
Not really, I would say. I mean, we have a lot of discussions going on here in terms of how do we integrate, let's say, esoteric practices with evidence-based practices. But I don't think that we have enough people who are willing to take the leading role in this,
Yeah.
So I would say I'm one of those people in this country that actually dare to do that. And that's thanks to my Pluto. That's why I love Pluto, because I have Pluto conjunct my MC in Scorpio. So, and I'm a psychologist, I'm a researcher. So, it's and an astrologer, but it's so important for me to be able to transform.
Wow, that's an incredible story. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know if anyone I know, including myself, knows of this legal restriction on practicing astrology in Sweden, if you're a clinical psychologist.
I think it's a bit different for you guys in the US. And I mean, that's also why I like to connect with people from United States of America, because you have, in some states, you seem to be more open to these kind of things.
Well, there was a movement, too, in the 70s of astrologers getting together to fight some of the arcane laws that were preventing astrologers from being free. But there were so many stories in the journals that I have here at CAELi of astrologers being kind of run out of town because they were trying to practice psychology and astrology. And so they were like being bullied and kind of persecuted. So something changed.
Like a modern witch hunt, I would say, it's my belief is that it's based on scientism, the belief that only science is valuable in life. And, that's why my upcoming book that I will release next year is basically about this topic, because I try to be a person that I say I stand with one foot in science, because I am a PhD student, I do research, I'm doing all those kind of things, very traditional psychology style. But I also have one foot in the esoteric. So I combine the evidence-based and the esoteric, and basically bridging modern astrology with evidence-based concepts related to positive psychology.
I love that.
Yeah, many people, perhaps they like to bridge astrology with, let's say, Jungian psychology, or I think we have more astrology that is related towards that kind of psychology. But I don't see as much astrology that tries to pair with positive psychology, or let's say cognitive behavioral therapy methods. And that's more my interest. So that's what my book is about. Yeah.
Amazing. And I love that you're also bringing up that, we can say there's many kinds of astrology, but I also think in the overwhelming trend of traditional astrology, there's this impression that psychological astrology is just one thing, not understanding perhaps or taking time to appreciate that psychology as a discipline has many facets. And so it's not all Jungian, it can be various other forms, like you're saying.
Exactly. And that's also something that I bring up in my book, because like you say, many people tend to think about psychology as one subject. But from my point of view, we have so many different branches. For example, traditional psychology is a lot about curing illnesses or bringing people from a deficit point to, like a baseline sort of, what psychiatry is about. We see people who fall out of the norms of society, that they lose their functionality somehow. We pathologize that and we try to bring them back into society, while we have the other kind of psychology, which is basically positive psychology, which can be more like a strengthening approach, or looking at what are your character strengths, or how can we find your values, how can we, instead of just making you survive, how can we make you thrive. It's a whole other way of looking at people. So that's why I say I'm quite against actually using astrology as a way to identify ADHD or other kind of neuropsychiatric diagnosis. I'm against using astrology to sort of pathologize people, or, oh, I'm seeing now the root of your anxiety. Like, that's not really my thing. I'm more about how can we find your values using astrology? How can we find a valued life direction, and how can you sort of come in contact with something more beyond yourself, and also see how you can find more of your own agency, because we have norms impacting us, everything is so driven by these societal norms and the way we see things. And I think astrology is a practice that allows us to rest from all of that, go beyond that.
I love that. I love that. Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. What would the second book be that you would take with you?
The second book would be actually a newer book that is called Fertility Astrology.
Hey!
You know about this book, yes?
Yeah, I worked with Nicola on that book.
I think she's amazing. Shout out. I think she's really amazing. And I first heard about her in the astrology podcast when she was there for an interview. And what I like so much about this book, I think it's called Fertility Astrology, a modern medieval textbook. So she tries to combine, I think, both more ancient methods with more of a modern perspective, right? And what I love so much about this book is that it really introduces the reader to a more of a complex understanding of like, how can we think about fertility in terms of the horoscope? Because there are these kind of other methods, right? There's a Hungarian or Czech doctor from back in the days. I'm not sure what his name is now. Jonas method, maybe it is.
Yeah, she's definitely not a fan of the Jonas method.
No. And I was thinking the same, because that's too simplified for me. So I love this book that it brings in, more of a complex perspective, and the use of also Almuten of Pregnancy. I like that. I mean, me being a modern astrology, I'm not so familiar with these concepts, obviously, but I love that I get introduction to them. And I also love the client stories in this book. And lastly, what I love so much about Nicola is basically that, just like I try to have one foot in science and one foot beyond, I'm trying to bridge the perspective. I'm trying to say that we can, merge these perspectives to find synergy. I think that she tries to bring forth the same kind of narrative. Because when I read the book and when I listen to her, for example, she says that we're not replacing medical treatment or science in that sense. It's more like something that can complement. And I think she has also referred to fertility astrology from her perspective as let the clients have their God chat. They can have the talk with the doctor that is very like, very dry in that sense. So this is the date for this and this and this. But, bringing in astrology into the picture is also a way to like add something else, add some sort of hope or some meaning or something esoteric, something beyond, And I really love that balance that she brings with this book. So I've also had my own personal story of struggling with fertility, and it's very interesting then again to read this book, because if you have, for example, like me, Jupiter in the 5th house, there are some astrologers that are going to say, "Oh, you're going to have a lot of kids," but again, it's more complex than that, and that's really why I love this book. It can really bring you so much more knowledge.
Yeah. So just to circle back to some of the techniques you mentioned to describe them for those who are listening, the Jonas method is the way that you would take the recurring moon-sun relationship. So if you're born at a full moon, then every full moon is an extra lucky time. Or if you're born at a moon sextile the sun on one side of it, let's say a waxing sextile, then every month when that happens, regardless of your actual ovulation, should theoretically be a lucky time. And Nikki pushes back against that pretty hard.
Yeah, and I also like that she brings in the psychological processes. For example, like I say, I have a moon in Scorpio, so I zoom in a little bit on that section in the book, and she talks a lot about also the psychological cycles that we can go through when it comes to, for example, struggling with infertility and these kind of things. It's like resentment and those kind of things. So I like her perspective a lot. So I'm very a big fan of hers.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, she does definitely bring in that more holistic, like whole human concept. And she talks about the sort of masculine side of it, because people don't just spontaneously get pregnant. There's usually more than one person involved. And so there's a side of it where it's like, if you're trying to conceive and you're maybe going to do it on your own, that's one perspective, but usually there's a couple. And so the non-gestational carrier's chart matters in the whole constellation. And I love the one part of that book where she shows that it's the non-gestational partner who's driving the actual conception in this timing for that couple. Because it's like the gestational carrier's chart wasn't exactly like turned on for babies, but because their partner had it, then they were able to bridge that and actually achieve pregnancy.
Exactly. And like I say, I think it's very well written, and like from an ethical point of view as well, because I think about it sometimes like, okay, what are the perks you can say about combining astrology with psychology? For me, it's the ethics, because as psychologists, we're so concerned with power dynamics, ethics, what are we allowed to do, not allowed to do. And, I think sometimes that we do need a little bit more of that perspective in our astrological practice as well. That's what I'm trying to bring forward. And I think she really manages to also shine light on how important that is. I feel like when she writes about this subject, it's both very respectfully written, but also very well written from an ethical point of view. She's not saying that astrology is going to, like this, make you become pregnant instantly just by, this method, She's not selling it like that. That's why I like that she's selling it as like a complementary practice that can enrich the process.
Right, exactly. The emphasis is on lucky times, not I'm going to get you pregnant. Like, try during your lucky times and see what happens. But there's no guarantee, obviously, like, because we can't play God. Yeah, awesome. Okay, so what would your third book be?
Well, my third book, there I was a little bit struggling, but I have a fourth book as well, as for the beginner.
You snuck one in there.
I have to say, it's The Inner Sky. I have to say this book. This is basically just because of the reason I told you in the beginning. It's the book I've read since the beginning. It's the book I was given by my ex-husband, and it's a book that I do keep coming back to somehow. Yeah. I even have some references from this book in my upcoming astrology book.
Hey.
Yeah, I do, because I do use references when I write astrology books as well.
That's awesome. I love hearing that. You've got to come over here and do all sorts of referencing at CAELi. There's so many things to reference.
Yeah, because, speaking about why I love this book so much is because it's actually a great introduction, and it's a book that brings me back to the basics. And being an astrologer, Just as my academic path, it's so easy to lose yourself trying to, I don't know, climb some kind of intellectual ladder, constantly evolving. But, I like to go back to very simple or basic books in that sense and be like, oh, right, we have elements, right? Like remember these kind of things and really be like, okay, key questions. What are like Steven Forrest's point of view on this? Or, I also like April Elliot Kent's books, for example, very simple books in that sense that can bring us back to the basics, because at the end of the day, we can complicate things as much as we want. And astrology is a very complex practice. You can make it super complex, right? Just like with psychology. But for me, at the end of the day, it's about how do I practice? How do I use this? How do I understand the very basics, basically?
I love that. And that's also lineage, right? I mean, you're taking your first book and then the companion. It's been your companion the whole time. It's lovely. How could you not be with it?
Exactly. And that's why I say when I wrote my astrology book, or it's basically an astrology psychology book, I call it, I did reference a lot to this book, The Inner Sky, just because it's kind of difficult. Like when you write academic papers in psychology, it's all about referencing, right? I cannot even say anything without mentioning that this comes from somebody else 20 years ago or something. But when it comes to writing astrology books, it's not, I don't think it's required in the same sense, right? It's not required.
No, but I'm hoping to change that. That's partly why CAELi's here. I'm like, let's remind ourselves, like we don't have a field awareness of the types of things that have been said before in our journals, in our books, because oftentimes access is limited to whatever's around you in the antiquarian bookshop, or maybe Barnes & Noble or some other small bookshop that doesn't have the huge collection. So you wouldn't even know to look, and there's no place to go to look, right? So I hear exactly what you're saying, but I'm hoping that CAELi can change that.
Yeah, I hope so. And that's why I love what you're doing. I think it's such an important work. And it's even more important now in our modern day times with, social media and technology and all these things, because you can see so many things on, for example, TikTok or Instagram. Sometimes I wonder, how did these people come up with these ideas? It doesn't really make sense.
There's no footnote. Where did you get
No, there's no footnote. Like, where is your reference? But that's why it's so important. And like I say, if I'm going to bridge, for example, in my book, planetary energies to modern concepts of evidence-based psychology, then I need to have some sort of reference to, okay, how do I interpret, for example, Pluto? Okay, this is my reference. This is one way of interpreting Pluto according to this person or this person. And from there, I can take that interpretation and I can mirror it to what I know from a scientific point of view and be like, okay, but look at this concept. I don't know, post-traumatic growth. Look, it mirrors, or, it's very important with the referencing, but some people tend to not think so. And I'm one of the people who do believe so. So I'm on your team.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so if someone was going to be learning astrology, which book would you place in their hands?
I would place, sorry to say, but The Inner Sky or The Essential Guide to Practical Astrology by April Elliot Kent. And that's just basically because, as a beginner, you need some sort of broader introduction to the subject, and you need to understand certain things. And one thing that I think is crucial in these beginners' books is basically the fact that Western tropical astrology is season-based. I mean, I think beginners today, I think it's kind of sad, a shame that some people get super interested in astrology and they learn a lot about the archetypes and the symbolism and the signs and this and that, but they tend to forget the basics, and they tend to forget the fact that, okay, if you practice modern Western tropical astrology, it doesn't really align with the astronomical, positions of the planetary bodies on the sky. And some people get so shocked, they have studied astrology for years, and then they find out, oh, why am I looking at the Skywalk app while I'm looking at the horoscope here in Astrogold? Why is there a difference, And for me, I think it's such a shame, because astrology is really about bringing the depth of the knowledge, and that's why we come back to the referencing as well. And that's probably my Plutonian side as well. I think it's important how the depth of things and, the legacy of things, just to know that an introduction book, it should really cover these aspects, about the basics, that it's not about the stars in that sense that people tend to believe,
Yeah, it's getting them that right orientation to understand, okay, astronomy is here, astrology can do this, and this is how it works over here.
And you need to then explain also precession, right?
Yeah, it all comes back to that.
And that's why I say it's maybe not so, I will say, sexy to write about in a book, for somebody who just wants to learn how to interpret a chart. But from my point of view, it's so important because, when I look up on the sky, I look at my AstroGold app and I identify the planets based on what I see in the app, right? I'm like, oh, there I can see something. Oh, that must be Mars. While like my partner, he's more into astronomy and he uses Skywalk and those kind of apps. But I think it's so beautiful that you can get sort of more of a thorough understanding. And it actually relates back to what we were saying about Sweden and the climate here and the astrological practice here. That I think it was when Venus and Jupiter were in conjunction.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. I think it was that planetary meeting, pretty bright one. Then I think the police got so many calls from people in this country, like people who were worried because they were like, oh, hello, something is going on in the sky and I don't know what it is. Is it some drone attack or what's happening?
Oh my gosh.
And that shows how disconnected people are in our modern society, and learning a little bit of the basics of, for example, astrology does also require a little bit of astronomy and understanding of our, entanglement with the cosmos and nature. That's why I'd say a good book to begin with need to have these parts in it, but also has to have the interpretive parts as well, right? So
yeah, absolutely. And I think the more you get into 20th century astrology, the more you'll find these really fascinating takes on the smallest adjustments astronomically to the movements of the Earth and what implications that has for modern interpretation. So I don't know, I just find that fascinating to see like, oh, they've measured that the whole of the Earth might wobble in this way, so now we have to redo everything and think about adding a correction to the way that we do progressions, for example. Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
And that's how we keep the practice alive, right? How we keep the legacy, or you say, like how astrology keeps evolving with our scientific advancements as well, and the way we look at society and how we live in society. I think about Chiron as well, right? That was discovered in that 77?
In 70s, yeah. And
it's so interesting how we learn so much about really connecting as above, so below.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking time I know it's very late where you are, so I really appreciate you coming onto the show. And where can people find you?
People can find me on, my website, esoteric-adventures.com. That's my brand, Esoteric Adventures Astrology.
Yeah.
Or they can find me on Instagram, esoteric_adventures.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Frida. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jen. It was nice meeting you.
Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.